Hi, everyone, wherever you are in the world this evening, from a wintry London. I'm Nicolette Duckham. I'm one of the board members of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum. And this evening, we've got Graham Jacobs joining us from South Africa. Just before I introduce him, just a couple of housekeeping things. We're going to be recording the talk so that everybody can access it online on the website later, so I hope that's okay. Graham will talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll have any questions or discussion afterwards, which I will take for him, and we'll ask him, to elaborate on anything that anybody wants to know. So I think, we better get going without waiting any longer. So anyway, today Graham is joining us to talk about heritage at risk in Southern Africa, and he'll discuss what makes these places special and what challenges and threats they're facing, and also how conservation initiatives at such sites can become a means of positive social change rather than negative ones, which is often seen as an unfortunate problem with some of these things, but it's not all bad news. Graham will talk about projects including Marmary in the Western Cape of South Africa. That's a village I know well from my childhood. I used to visit quite often, so I'll be very interested to hear about that. Graham's a conservation architect and a heritage specialist based in South Africa. He also holds a master's degree in conservation from the University of York. And he and I first worked together from 1986, when we were both formed part of the emerging urban conservation unit at the City Council of Cape Town. Since then, he's been a council member of the Heritage Western Cape, including chair of its Built Environment and Landscape Committee. And besides numerous built heritage projects in South Africa, he's also a special heritage advisor to the World Bank's International Finance Corporation and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And construction projects in this capacity have included those in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And he's also a member of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum's International Advisory Committee. So I think we'll hand over to him now. And Graham, it's over to you and the slides, and I will put myself on mute.
That's fine. Thank you, Nicolette. Can everyone hear me? You can hear me okay?
Yes, seems to be
Okay.
fine.
All right, that's fine. Okay. Okay. Thanks to everyone who is here, are here. Um, I've chosen to speak about these particular sites because they encapsulate, in many ways, a lot of the challenges that face heritage, especially in rural areas in Southern Africa. Many of these are sites of quite considerable heritage significance, but the people who live in them don't have the means to restore or maintain them properly. So that's the crucial question, and there are many more sites like this, but I just thought, let me use these ones as an example, or as examples. Two of them are in South Africa, and one of them is in Lesotho. I've been involved in these projects, so I know them reasonably well, which is why I've decided to use them. So, okay, so the subjects I'm going to be speaking about are the Moravian mission settlements in Mamre and Witwater, and then the royal village of Leratori, which is in Lesotho. Now, I should just mention that I actually live not far from one of these sites. That's the one in the one at Mamre. I live in a small country town that's Darling, which is just up the road, about 16 kilometers away. Okay, so trying to get this thing to work. Ah, there we go. It's a bit of a delay. Okay, so okay. Now, this is typical of the mission settlement layouts that were pioneered by the Moravians in Southern Africa. And this is the second settlement that they established in South Africa, following the formula of having agricultural allotments along central stream with the houses facing onto them, in this case on either side, sometimes you have the stream on one side with a mountain on the one and then the houses on the other. So what you have here is this format was then adopted by other mission who did missionary work in South Africa. This, as you can see, is the village component of Mamre. The actual other component is sitting up here, which is the church precinct. And I will come to why this is so significant. In fact, what I will do is I'll why these Moravian settlements are significant, and as Nicolette has mentioned, what their challenges are, what their opportunities are, and I'll do the same for the example in Lesotho. Okay, so what makes these settlements, the Moravian settlements, now significant? I think the first one is that they were the first to establish mission settlements in South Africa, and you can see from 1738. And they were instrumental in powering the First Nation groupings in Southern Africa, in South Africa, as well as rural communities through, as you can see, through literacy, agriculture, and manufacturing industry. They were really pioneers in many ways. They not only were involved in establishing the first teachers training college in South Africa, but they also had a significant impact on communities which were marginalized by colonialism, encouraging relationships across racial and cultural divides. And an important point was encouraging self-reliance. And that included during the apartheid era in South Africa, where if you've been to any of these communities, you will see that there is there's a very different attitude to the way they see people, because these communities weren't ones that were directly affected, affected by the apartheid system, in that they never they were taught never to be regarded as second citizens in the country. They were also, Moravian settlements played an important role in the emancipation of slavery. Or what people don't realize often is that after emancipation, many of the emancipated slaves had a really, really tough time in being, first of all, absorbed by society. They struggled to find work. Many faced poverty and unemployment. And it was the mission stations, particularly the Moravian mission stations, that took them in and where they established themselves. So for all these reasons, the Moravian mission settlements in Southern Africa are really historically very important in the history of the country. But they are facing problems. There is currently now widespread poverty. Many of the mission settlements that I was referring to, they are very run down. Their drug abuse is rife. So is unemployment, particularly where some of these settlements are isolated, and many of them are. Because there has been limited skills transfer from previous generations to the current generation. And as a result, certain skills in maintaining their environments have been lost. One that hasn't been lost was their skills in thatching. That one thing that seems to have survived, although others haven't. Particularly because of this lack of employment in the areas, there's been a large migration to the city. And as a result, you see the people in these settlements often comprising young people these settlements still have schools, and old people who've retired. And it's that in itself is a problem. So there's another problem with the Moravian Church, in that the headquarters is regarded by many of these mission settlements, their citizens, as as they feel they may neglected, they're not being listened to by head office, and so there are feelings of quite, in some cases, quite strong, quite deep suspicion between head office in Cape Town and some of the more isolated rural communities. Um, because of that isolation, service to some of them becomes particularly difficult. I was going to initially use some examples from Wuppertal here, but I did speak about Wuppertal in a previous talk I gave. I can't remember whether it was either earlier on this year or last year. So I wasn't going to repeat that, other than to say that Wuppertal itself has a number of outstations, some of them really isolated. And these people would simply not survive there without subsistence farming. So that's what they do. And in many cases, these are time capsules. And a big problem with the head office is that these are clerics. They have no business acumen and no entrepreneurial initiative to speak of, even though the Moravian Church is probably one of the largest landowners in South Africa. I mean, they should really be thinking of how they can use that land for development in some cases, to fund a lot of these really significant historic settlements. So those are really the main challenges, but there are also opportunities. Um, because of this isolation that many of them have, there's also a high degree of historical authenticity of the built fabric, as well as in their social traditions. I mentioned these places being time capsules, and in many cases they are. I mean, you'll find, for example, in some of the outstations of Wuppertal, people are still baking bread once a week in ovens, wood-fired ovens outside their houses. Now, this is a tradition that goes back to pioneering days in South Africa. We're talking about 17th century practices, which are still ongoing. Um, and because of that, many of these landscapes have become rare because the ones closest to the urban centers have become significantly transformed. Um, the ones that are more isolated, and because of the lack of funds, there's ironically not been the money to embark on extensive so-called upgrades, and consequently, a lot of these villages, in particular, they're in terrible condition, but they also still have a high degree of authenticity. Now, and because of that, there is a enormous potential for these places to accommodate guests. I mean, you're talking about places that have have unique visitor experience for people who want to go there, and yet there's very little in the way of places where these people can stay. And but there are very few competing guest facilities. So there is a real opportunity, and that could be harnessed without actually necessarily changing the culture, the special culture that these places have. Um, the other important point, which is a great advantage, is that they, there is already an established hierarchy. The church is the hierarchy. And within that framework, one can actually get quite a bit done by actually relying on the hierarchy to make sure that what one plans to do actually gets carried out. They do the implementation, they will actually engage the local people. And it's an important point there because in all of these projects, we try to use the labor of as many local people as possible as job creation initiative, as well as being a job, if you could call it a training on the job initiative, so that they're able to acquire niche skills that they can then use, they can then market to others, the other old places, particularly farmsteads in the area. And there are quite a few. And the niche skills I'm talking about are not necessarily high tech skills or anything particularly fancy, but just the use of the proper and responsible use of lime mortars and renders, for example, is something which is generally quite foreign in South Africa. Still needs to be a much greater awareness of what to do. And so by training these people in the proper use of those materials, that alone gives them a niche advantage over others. Okay, so I showed you that layout earlier on of that area layout of Wuppertal, of Mamre. This is what it looks like on the ground, and you will see that the agricultural allotments are still very much there, and they are used in the case of Mamre. The buildings, on the other hand, have changed dramatically. These are people that are closer to the city, so there have been greater employment opportunities, and they've done home improvements to their properties, which have actually basically eroded a lot of the built character. However, the layout is still there, and unlike the village area or the residential area, the church precinct still retains substantially intact. Now, this is an interesting area in Mamre because, as you can see there, on the left, I'm showing you these buildings are all still there in one form or another. This was when Mamre was known as Groene Kloof. It was a Dutch East India Company outpost. It was actually a military outpost at the time. This drawing dates back to 1780, but we're looking at the late 1600s, from about 1688 onwards, that this outstation was first established. And what happened was when the Dutch East India Company went bankrupt, the Earl of Culloden, who was governor at the Cape at the time, approached the Moravians and said, look, we know you've made such a success of your first mission station in South Africa that we want you to take this one over, because it had been standing there abandoned. So they took over these buildings. And you will see, I'll show you now, they constructed a church pretty much in this position here, and another shop here. So you got a precinct that is actually historically very interestingly layered. This is what it looks like today, approaching from roughly the same direction. That central house that I showed you in the previous picture, that's it there. That was the manager, or the person, as they called him in Afrikaans, the posthouder. He was the person in charge, making sure the outpost ran properly. This is a relatively late building. It's late 19th century, but these ones at the back are some of those buildings that I showed you in that previous sketch. There you can see it again. There's this house now houses the parsonage for the settlement, for the precinct, church precinct, and there's the church on that side. That row of buildings that I showed you behind, these are them, and these are known to have existed by 1700. This one here, which is now the church office, was the Dutch East Company barracks. This is the back of the parsonage that I was referring to later. Now, fortunately, in this particular case, during a stage, I got to know the minister very well. This is him in the middle here with the checked shirt. He was brought in on a rotational basis. That's how all the ministers work in the Moravian Church. They normally don't stay for longer than 4 or 5 years. In his case, he stayed there for almost 8 years because of the impact he had on the settlement. The first thing he realized was that in order to uplift people, you need to give them a decent environment in which to live. And so he went about an initiative to start maintaining or starting to repair a lot of those buildings which had fallen into serious trouble. And this is some of the work that had been done. This you'll see here was a collapse that occurred because of leaking thatch at the eaves line, which is a typical problem when you've got buildings with sunbreak bricks. So here you've got the two women who are project managers on the one side and some of the guys on others, these two, the carpenters, people from the local community. I was brought in to assist with this and very much just providing a guiding hand, because I think that's the important thing when one gets engaged with communities like this. one is actually not the expert. One has a fair amount of experience when it comes to landscapes and historic precincts like this. But in many ways, they're the experts. So you have to listen to them, but and then guide, and then but they must actually have the final say. So anyway, this is what happened. That's the building. After the work, that reconstruction work was completed and still looking in pretty good, decent condition. You can see there's some rethatching done. That was by 2019. This is it in 2011. But unfortunately, since the Reverend Reuters moved on, he actually became a bishop in the Moravian Church, and he was sent somewhere else. And since then, there's been pretty lackluster performance. In fact, I wasn't even asked to come back to give any advice since he left, which was a pity. But And so that's how the building looks today. This is the old barracks building. It's still, fortunately, pretty much intact, but you can see that it's starting to show wear because it hasn't been regularly maintained. But there's a worse example, and this is the old mill in Momri. Most of these settlements had their mill, and they would derive an income from the mills by also grinding the corn for surrounding farmers. And that was the case here in Mummery. And in fact, this mill was in operation until 1954. It was restored with a grant in 1993, and then it fell into disuse and it was effectively abandoned. And a mysterious fire broke out there. We think it's probably people, vagrants, we're not quite sure. And that was the result. What you have here on the left was the result of that. I became involved, and with community work, working together, a lot of community involvement, the mill was restored. But since then, nothing really has happened, not even with the church headquarters, very little support. And you'll even see, look at the mill wheel. It's gradually being stolen bit by bit for scrap metal. It's absolutely it's really discouraging to see this, particularly after all the trouble that went into the restoration and the people involved and the effort that went into doing this. You can see the graffiti on the wall. So this is the kind of challenge that is faced with these places. Very much an up and down experience. Just as you think that there's a hopeful future, you get someone coming along who really does not, who's in charge of the church, who really does not follow up in the way that he should. And it really comes down to a point, once again, of education, insight into what to do and how to do it. This is the shop, what was the settlement shop in the historic church precinct. That was as it was in 2011, and it was being run as a restaurant at the time. And it was because visitors coming there were very keen to have a place where they could actually have something to eat, and it was working very well. The subsequent minister came in and closed the restaurant because he felt there weren't enough people attending. So the place fell into disuse. And this was what happened. We had a wall collapse in 2023 because it hadn't been adequately maintained. There had been a film shoot. This place had been used for quite a few film shoots just because of its unique character. And this was added. Look at the etching rails. It was for some other Western movie, believe it or not. And but this is the problem now. It hadn't been properly maintained, and so once again, thatch at the eaves thins out, water gets into the sun-baked bricks, saturates the walls, and they collapse under their own weight. So that's the kind of problem. That is the case with Momri. Now let's go and look at Wittewater, which is almost at the other end of the scale. Compared to Wittewater, Momri has actually got it pretty good. This is Wittewater. That is their agricultural allotment. You can see none of it used anymore. You can see where the stream ran through. They're not even using the water properly. It's running through here. The one advantage that the settlement has is that it does still have some intact or reasonably intact vernacular architecture along Church Street. The church is basically over there. This side has actually been substantially altered. But while we were working on this project, we would get visitors coming saying, "We'd love to stay here. Where could we stay?" And there was no place for them to stay. That is what the settlement looks like from the other side, looking across those agricultural allotments towards those buildings I was talking to you about. And that is pretty much the way in which those settlements would have looked, more or less, during their heyday. They would, of course, have been a lot, they would have been maintained a lot better. Okay, so that was that was the condition of the buildings. That was the condition of the buildings when I was asked to become involved in 2007. Highly authentic still, a lot of it surviving, but in terrible condition because you've got a poverty-stricken community. This is what the insides looked like. Here's an example. People were actually living in these houses. Look, I mean, here holes in the roofs. I don't know if you can see it, but this was a dung floor that has become muddy just because the rain just runs through. You can see how people have been. Just look at this. This is the condition that a lot of the people have been living in. Now, fortunately, with the municipal initiative, we were able to start a reconstruction project here using housing funds allocated to the local authority for housing purposes. And we were able to get stuck in. The idea was to do a pilot project and then follow that up with another project which would at least be able to restore a lot of the upper village, Church Street, as it's called. I mean, this guy here, he was retired. He'd been doing no work at all. He was unemployed until we found out that he could actually lay stone. And we asked, well, why did you tell us? He said, well, no one had asked him. So this is I mean, you can see this is very much, these are all local people working and working with very much improvised conditions. Look at this, for example. That's the sieve. It's sifting the sand. And it's basically an old bed which has got some mesh over the one side so they could. Yeah, we are. You can't really get more low tech than this, but that's that we were using to save costs. This is the team on that particular project, and if you look carefully, you'll see that the people here are either pretty old. His part, that's Farney. He passed away about 8 years ago. And there's Dirk, the other guy who was one of the people working with me on this, who was helping to decide who we would employ. But you'll see everyone else here, they're either women or they're young. And that's the situation you have in these settlements because people of employable age are all trying to get work, mainly young men in the cities. This is an example of what we were able to do with the limited resources we had at the time. That, as you can see on the left, was as it was. On the right was after we completed that work in 2008, calling in all the favors we could. The idea was then to actually approach companies and say to the company directors, for the price of your house, we can actually restore this entire settlement. Unfortunately, we got hit with that economic slump. You'll remember it in 2008, where everyone was scrambling, banks had no money, and that was really what screwed that initiative, unfortunately. But anyway, just to show you once again the comparison between what we had before and afterwards, this is plastic that was hung between the tie beams of these trusses to catch the rain. You'll see that is water in there, and their children sleeping out. That was so. I mean, Tuberculosis, you would find, would be rife in these places. Typical. We were at least able to get them to this condition so that at least they had a healthy place to stay. But this is the kind of challenges we faced. Now, that is what you earlier this looked like in 2008. Since then, there's been absolutely no maintenance on these places. Once again, it comes down to direction from the church. Either that, or they need to get people with the necessary skills to help them to to um, to at least take this project forward. It's definitely a need for guest accommodation in these places, and that once again will be a source of income. We had initially seen some of these houses being used for uh, for accommodation, but like I say, this is the situation we have at the moment. Just another person wants to see how the work that is done there, and in fact, that very little, if anything, has been done since then. Okay, so that's the situation with the Moravian mission settlements in South Africa. Now I'm going to take you to the royal village in Makeneng in Lesotho. Now I was involved with a colleague there in introducing the members of the built environment, people with architects. Some of them were planners, some of them were museologists. We were approached during COVID the year before to see if we could actually do an online a beginner's course, an introduction to conservation to these people at the initiative of a museum in Morija, which is, I suppose you could say, a settlement in Lesotho, which has got very, very strong cultural connections. And it's known to be one of the centers of literature, for example, in the country. So nearby in Makeneng is the kraal, the royal village of Lerotoli. Now, Lerotoli is a very highly revered figure in Lesotho history because he actually resisted attempts by the authorities at the Cape, who'd been delegated by what was then the England to manage Lesotho, and the Cape authorities decided that they needed to disarm the Sotho people, and Lerotoli would have none of this. And so they led the authorities to try to enforce this on a song and dance through what is a very mountainous kingdom. And these people, of course, knew the place like the back of their hands. And finally, the local authorities the authorities at the Cape had to relent. And so that made and then England took back the administration of Lesotho, and that finally led to Lesotho's independence. So Lerotoli is a very, very important figure in Sotho history. What is interesting about this? We'll come to that now. What makes the settlement significant? Because of its history, because of its association with Chief Lerotoli, Paramount Chief Lerotoli, who was the grandson of the founder of the Basotho Nation, and because it comprises one of the highest concentrations of dressed sandstone structures in Lesotho. This is a country which has, apart from the capital Maseru and Morija, which is a small village, we're talking about hamlets here, little rural villages, and and most of those are the typical circular structures, many of them sun-baked brick that are then plastered with a clay. They've got a clay plaster. These are a lot of these buildings in this settlement are rectilinear. They're more European in that sense, and they really have some very, very good stonework. They're becoming increasingly rare as the use of sandstone for traditional construction is being replaced by cement blocks. And that is as a result of the marketing by companies in surrounding South Africa. I mean, Lesotho is landlocked and it's surrounded by South Africa on all sides. Um, and I will show you some of the pretty high levels of craftsmanship. Um, each of Leratoli's wives had three houses, and they would use the one for cooking in, the other one would be their residence, and the third one would be for receiving guests. So the village comprises these structures, but they, like the examples, the Moravian examples, are facing significant problems. One of them is just the lack of official recognition by the Lesotho government itself, and which is really frustrating for the interest group at Morija, who do see the importance of the settlement. It has really very strong historical importance. Ironically enough, that museum is run by an American, a former diplomat, who just was so charmed by Lesotho during his tenure that he resigned his job with the US Embassy, and he eventually became the curator of the museum at Morija, and single-handedly has acquired documents from all over Lesotho, and that museum is now, you can say, the unofficial archive of Lesotho. And once again, limited general transfer of traditional building skills, although there are still some. Once again, the aggressive marketing of cement, modern building materials from surrounding South Africa. Once again, migration of younger generations, in this case to the only really substantial urban center, which is Masira. And as a result, the local population is aging. And that includes those that still have the skills to do this work, the maintenance work. And it's ironic that there's most of the recognition of the village is from people outside the heritage that understand or appreciate the heritage significance of the village, are from outside Lesotho, apart from a few local niche interest groups. And once again, like in the case of the Moravian examples, a lack of business acumen and entrepreneurial initiative. So these are the challenges, but there are opportunities as well. Once again, a high degree of historical authenticity, both not just in terms of the built fabric, but also the surviving local traditions that go with it and that are an integral part of the sense of place of this village. And interestingly enough, once again, it's ironic that it's outsiders that recognize the potential first. In this case, the European Union, who has been assisting in some initiatives to record the village, and they partially that, and with a grant from the Italian government, assisted in getting us to the site. We were asked to do a follow-up, if you like, practical class in basic conservation techniques after the online course we'd given the year before. And then, of course, there's the spectacular scenic context in which the village is located, and once again, it's attractive to outsiders because of the unique visit experience that it has to offer. And there's once again unexploited or insufficiently exploited use of local hospitality, which would once again become a source of employment. And I mentioned the Morija, which is nearby. It's close by, and so there are people there that are assisting. And in fact, it was the Morija Museum people that were highly supportive, highly instrumental in getting us to be able to do the trip to Lesotho. And there is an established network of interest groups, but none of them until the classes that we gave. We were there for a week. None of them related to the building industry, the built environment. So we were able to engage with local architects and planners and museologists and archivists. And that did create a lot of enthusiasm. This is the scene, the kind of scenery I was talking about. I mean, Lesotho had really got it. This is the outlook from the church in which we gave our classes. And this is the church. So you'll see what I mean when I say that there are issues here. The part on the right is obviously not being used, but the part on the left is where we held our classes. In fact, I was able to use the part on the right here to illustrate to the students how you can apply the middle third rule. In other words, to know when a structure is becoming dangerous or not. I.e., if a wall is leaning over more than a third of its thickness, it's becoming seriously dangerous. This one was leaning over more than that, and the only reason it was still there, was still in place, was because of the trusses holding it together. This part, but after about 3 weeks after we were back in South Africa, I got this call from one of the class, one of our students who's saying, "You were right. In fact, that wall has since collapsed." So that's the interior. That's where we gave our classes. You'll see the overhead projector there. We had to run a cable for about half a kilometer to the nearest school just so we could have electricity. And to give you an idea of just the basic facilities we're dealing with, this on the right is the church bell. And the hammer just lies there on the grass. And anyone who wants to call people for services or a meeting, then they just use the hammer. But otherwise, the hammer just lies there on the ground. Um, that, once again, this is the stone village at Makineng. These buildings, you can see the colonial influence here. This one seems to have always had a corrugated iron roof, but this has got the more traditional thatch. And this one, these would have had thatch, but then they obviously thought it was a bit too much effort to replace the thatch, so they became flat corrugated iron roofs. But this is some of the detail in some of the stonework, some of the, and you can see. I mean, this is pretty good stuff, and that is. This is one of the chief's wives, and you can see the sort of domestic, the needlework, the scissors that actually depicted on this one stone block, but other things as well, as you can see. Very, very interesting place. And this is another view of the same thing. I've included this one so you can see there has been maintenance, and all this maintenance, these are stone blocks that are laid in a clay dung mortar. No, there is no lime, no source for lime in Lesotho. They don't have it there. So this is how the vernacular architecture has evolved. But you can see how Portland cement has crept in here, and it is becoming an increasing problem. Now, next to the church is a building called the Evangelist's House, or what's left of it. And this building we then used as a training platform for various techniques, demonstrating to students, not just us, but also some of the locals who are now getting on in years, who still do this work, who actually still have maintained the skills in using traditional clay plasters. Well, I suppose you can call them plasters. I suppose they're renders, and stone laying and thatching. These and also uh, constructing these windbreaks that they do. You'll see even the joints are, it's all hand platted using local grass. So this is showing the young people how this work is done. This is one of our class people. This is one of our students. There's another one. These are the women doing the work, and they're getting so enthusiastic they're joining in and doing it themselves. I wanted to get involved in the say, and they said to me, "No, this is only work for women," so I wasn't allowed to do that. And this is an example of some of just demonstrating how they were laying stonework in a clay dung mortar. this is the end of that course where they all got the certification, and this led to the founding of the first built environment conservation group in Lesotho. This is the diplomat who's running the Marija Museum, and you can see everyone else here. This is my colleague who was there on the course with me. All the others, some of them architects, some of them planners. A really nice bunch of people. They gave us at the end, they gave us traditional Sotho blankets to go back home. So that is quite nice. So just a couple of concluding points. Um, Looking at both the Moravian examples and the example in Lesotho, with the right connections and right people in place, you can do a lot with relatively little. And I mean, these are cases where the highest tech you're going to get on these sites is a laptop and maybe an overhead projector, but of course we'll use them very effectively. But other than that, I mean, you're talking about clipboards and tape measures. This is how, but that's fine. It works, and there's no reason why it shouldn't. You make do with what you've got, and it's amazing what you can do with what you've got. And then the other important point is look for the people in the area that are the champions who actually understand what needs or would like to see these improvements, would like to see this heritage recognized and maintained. And they become the people who spearhead the project, also because they know the locals and they know who to employ, who to engage in the work that needs to be done, and who to avoid. So look for local champions within the local community. Then employ as many locals in the project as possible because they need to be shareholders. They need to feel, obviously, they are the custodians. We just move in and we go back out again. These are the people that live there. And they need to feel that this is part of them. So it's very important to do that. And then looking at this, there's a lot of heritage at risk in Southern Africa, and one cannot look to either the South African government or the Lesotho government to provide the funding for this. All of this is either by private initiative or by foreign donors. In South Africa, a lot of it is private initiative. Our wine estates, for example, which are well enough known, and they do attract a lot of visitors, they sustain themselves. But it's when you get to the rural communities where there is a lot of poverty, where there aren't these resources, that the greatest challenges lie. But this is also where the highest degrees of material authenticity often exist. They just have not had the funds to make major changes. And then the importance is to use these projects as a vehicle for community empowerment. And you can do that with the in-house on the project training that I was talking about. A lot of this is not complicated to do, but once people know what to do, and then you've provided them with another skill that they can market into surrounding and outlying areas. And the last one, just remember that the locals are actually the real experts. We as outsiders, however experienced and skilled we may be or think we may be, we can only be there to guide. And that's it, folks. That's the talk. I will unshare so that we can get back to you, Nicolette.
Thank you, Graham. Right. Let's see what we've got in the chat. Right. I'm just looking if anyone's got any questions. Bob Burley has one. Many thanks for the talk, he says, and the focus on the small, local, low-tech solutions. But is there no state interest or help provided at all to help preserve this important heritage? From what you're saying, it sounds as though it's fairly minimal.
It is fairly Lesotho, particularly low because the government doesn't although their legislation is also different to the legislation in South Africa. In South Africa, the legislation allows for custodianship to be devolved to the appropriate tier. So, we have a three-grade system, as you know, Nicolette, where national heritage resources are addressed by the National Heritage Authority. Those of provincial or regional significance are dealt with at the provincial authority level, and then by far the most of these heritage resources, probably about 85%, idea is for them to be dealt with at local authority level. Whereas in Lesotho, for example, everything is centralized. It's a national heritage act, and so they particularly have to rely on foreign donorship, donor funding. And for me, the greatest um, lack, the greatest issue to address is skills, awareness, and giving these people training so they can understand, first of all, the significance of what they're dealing with, and then how to go about addressing that.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the big things that obviously has come out of what you've been saying this evening. I mean, obviously
Mm,
reviving traditional skills, which is
mm,
great, and then it leads to further employment later, which is a sort of long-term benefit of that kind of thing, which I think is great. And that's something that the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, of course, is working with, isn't it, and supporting at the moment, trying to sort of increase that kind of training and traditional skills training that is so desperately needed. Yeah, I thought it's really
well,
interesting.
one
I
of
mean,
the
the
things
pressures. Sorry, carry on.
No, sorry, I was just going to say one of the things I'm hoping by the CHF seeing what's happening, that this may lead to some of those people actually being able to get training, because it's all about training and awareness. You cannot just keep on funding them from outside, because you can see what's happening. Places are being restored and then they just deteriorate again.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's that sort of sustainability issue,
yes,
isn't it? The longer
yes.
term solution, finding long term
Mm,
sustainable kind of maintenance of the buildings. As you say,
mm,
trying to find new uses, including
mm,
people actually continuing to live there, but
mm,
hospitality. I mean, what a great one, and what a shame that the vision and the sort of long term vision doesn't seem to be there amongst those in higher power, which I think is a huge shame. I mean, you said some of the
mm,
pressures of dealing with the authorities, and probably motivation being another one.
mm, mm,
Self-sufficiency, the changing social structure, which is really interesting, women and children being the sort of major people
mm,
that remain,
mm.
the economics
Mm,
of the men having to
mm,
leave. So they're not even gardening, they're not even providing, they're
mm,
not even self-sufficient, which
mm,
I think is a huge shame. And then, of course, the post-colonialism side of things to deal with as
mm,
well, which
mm,
is always a tricky one. But I mean, it sounds as though they have so much potential, and it's just such a shame that all this good work happens and then it seems to sort of often slump again. And I
mm,
think that's
mm.
something obviously needs to be, it's all very well bringing in the money and dealing with
Yeah,
these buildings and bring them back into habitation, but then you need to keep them going after that,
exactly.
be
And they
maintained.
need to do that. We can't, outside assistance can't do that. We can only be catalysts.
Yeah, well, I do hope that that perhaps, as you say, the Commonwealth Heritage Forum can assist in some
Mm,
way in the future. I see we've got another post here from Abiyomi, which sorry, Odewale Abiyomi, sorry, a civil engineer. He says from Nigeria, which is great.
mm,
Presentation, he says, was insightful. I'm drawn to develop my capacity in preserving heritage sites in Nigeria and Africa by extension, in line with your mission. Are there ways I can develop my capacity in that regard? I mean, training, etc. Well, I think that's one for you, perhaps, Graham, to
mm.
respond to.
Well,
Um,
you know, uh, I think that is once again where the CHF can play a key role, because for me, it was particularly at the height of apartheid. We went to study at York, and because of the cultural isolation of South Africa in those times, um, I got exposed to issues that I I hadn't, I hadn't occurred to me, before, and then taking that knowledge back to South Africa, where the so-called leading proponents in conservation work at the time were actually they were they weren't plugged in to good international practice. So it took a while, as you know, Nicolette, you were there with me, and how long it took to actually slowly start persuading those people. But that's how it goes. So um, I would say you need key people, professionals who are prepared, who've got the time, who can actually take the advantage of courses like that. They need necessarily do a whole postgraduate degree, but at least get plugged into the network, and then the international network. Um, Question it, of course, because not all of it will be appropriate to their own context, but at least be aware of what is out there, how it's being discussed, and how it could be applied to your own specific environment and conditions, economic conditions.
Yeah, I think that's so important, isn't it?
Mm.
You have to adapt to the place where you are.
Mm.
The
Mm.
knowledge is general, but then you need to adapt. I think with Adewale, I think do contact the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, because I think that's something that we all who are on both the International Advisory Committee and the board can probably help with and advise. So I think it's definitely a good idea to be in touch. We've got Prince, I think, who knows quite a lot
Mm.
about what's going on in Nigeria, and I think that would possibly be quite useful. So do be in touch. I think that could be very beneficial, and it's great to make the contacts too through this kind of forum, which is really helpful. People who we might not otherwise know about, and
Mm.
to form those networks. Right. Has anyone else got anything else they'd like to add before we wrap up? Um, it seems not at the moment. So I think
Let
we've
me
done.
just say, let me
Yeah,
just
carry on.
say oh, okay.
No, no,
Um,
carry on, Graham.
Okay, I wanted to say that I specifically showed these types of projects here. It's not that I don't get involved in some pretty sophisticated restoration project. In fact, I'm doing two at the moment. I've just finished one where there has been enough money, where we have been able to apply state-of-the-art techniques. But that I think not, but I think where the CHF could be particularly useful is in dealing with these more grassroots situations, because I think ultimately it will have more impact.
Yeah, I think so. You're right. And you don't need to spend a lot of money to have maximum
Mm.
impact. And I
Mm.
think that's a really important thing to come out of this. So yeah, I think that's a good takeaway from this one. I think someone else might have added something. Oh, David Howard says, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. As a Moravian minister in Britain with experience in having to engage with a large heritage project in Birmingham, I'm continually challenged by the balance the church has to engage with between heritage and the church community.
Mm.
Are we a faithful community of faith or custodians of buildings? Not all churches have the money. Well, yes, I mean that's an interesting discussion in itself, and I think that's obviously what you've encountered as well. Besides the perhaps antipathy towards the
Mm.
church authorities in Cape Town, who seem a long way away from a community like that. So I think there's quite a lot to think about here and
I think
take away, and hopefully people might be in touch with us as
I
well.
think one has to be
Carry
I
on.
think one has to be creative in the way one uses budgets, because, like the case of Wittewater that I showed you, we actually used a housing budget to do what was, in effect, restoration stroke conservation work. And we can't, ironically, use that type of thing anymore because they changed the Municipal Services Act so that local authority or government money cannot be spent on private property anymore, as was previously the case. But it's about creative budgeting, I think. And also, I'm sure that the Moravian case here there in the UK is going to be very different to the kinds of things that we're dealing with here. But in the end, I think it's got to, you, heritage has got to be useful for people. We cannot turn everything into museums, as you well know. Uh, we can't just have them standing there not doing anything. They've got to function. They've got to provide shelter. They've got to, pragmatic responses are very important. Otherwise, we just end up by marginalizing heritage, which is a big problem in Southern Africa because it's regarded as an elitist pursuit. And you've got to basically explain, show people that actually this can actually help to empower them.
Yes, I mean it's finding innovative ways, isn't it? And getting that innovative ways to carry out this sort of work, and also finding the balance between conservation and practicality, which is what
Yes.
conservation is all about in the end, and
Mm,
finding that balance, and trying to
mm,
turn perhaps something quite negative into a positive. But
mm,
some of that is education, of course, and then the finance. But
mm,
you have to have
mm,
huge budgets to achieve a great deal, and I think that's really interesting. Thank you so much,
mm.
Graham. It's just, yeah, I think we need to wrap up. And thank you,
Okay.
everybody, for joining us just before Christmas. And good festive season to all, and hopefully a good break for
Yes,
lots of people. And
from me
thank you.
too.
Yes, indeed. And I'm sure as well from Meg, who very kindly has set everything up for us. And we'll probably finish the recording now. So we'll say goodnight to everybody, or goodbye wherever you are, and hopefully see you next year at the next series. Many thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.